Hi everyone, I'm Kate Tarasky, Director of Operations here at the Association. The Operational Sustainability Award is given to an American Public Gardens Association member garden or coalition of gardens in recognition of their outstanding dedication and achievements in promoting sustainability through their programs, operations, facilities, and/or research. Factors in selecting an award winner include influence, innovation, and applicability to the public garden world and beyond. In 2019, this year's awardee conducted a full sustainability audit to identify areas of concern and improvement. The gap analysis of the focus areas identified goals for the garden aligned with the Association's Sustainability Index. Garden programming grew to include sustainability topics, which spurred the development of a voluntary staff green team that meets monthly to implement internal changes, especially in energy and waste reduction. The Association is pleased to present this year's Award for Operational Sustainability to Bok Tower Gardens in Lake Wales, Florida.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tommy Rosebluth, Program Coordinator at the American Public Gardens Association, and I will be your staff representative during this virtual conference. Before we begin, here are a couple of tips to get the most out of your virtual conference experience. First, if you're experiencing poor audio or video quality, we suggest closing other programs on your computer, especially other browser tabs. Your inbox will still be there at the end of the session, I promise. If you have any other problems or questions, association staff are available to help. Give us a call at 610-708-3010 or send us an email at info@publicgardens.org. Second, while this session has been pre-recorded, the presenters are here with us today as panelists and will be happy to take questions in the live question and answer portions of the session. At some point during this session, the presenters may activate a poll. Poll responses are anonymous, so be sure to let us know how you really feel. Finally, you can submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A function that you will find in your Zoom toolbar. Questions can be submitted anonymously. You can also upvote other questions to indicate you would like to hear them answered. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the live Q&A portion of this session. Some questions may be answered directly through the Q&A feature. Thank you and enjoy today's session.
Hi everyone. Today we are going to discuss prioritizing conservation and how we can use conservation and threat assessments to meet the global and the North American strategy for plant conservation's 2020 targets. I am Christina Carrero. I'm a tree conservation research assistant at the Morton Arboretum. The Global Strategy for Plant Conservation outlined targets between 2011 and 2020, whereas the North American Botanic Gardens Strategy for Plant Conservation outlines for 2016 to 2020. And the goals are to help, again, guide our plant conservation efforts. And there are 16 targets outlined in the Global Strategy, many of which incorporate aspects of threat assessments and guided conservation action. Two of which are highlighted here. Target 2, to have an assessment of the conservation status of all known plant species as far as possible to guide conservation action. And Target 8, to have at least 75% of threatened plant species in ex situ collections, preferably in the country of origin, and at least 20% available for recovery and restoration programs. And I highlight target 8 because today we really want to discuss how Botanic Gardens have contributed to specialist groups and to conservation assessments, and how they can assist in covering at least 75% of threatened plant species in their collections. So far, I want to highlight where we're at. You can see up here about 50,000 or 5,000 North American plants have been assessed on the red list. This has been a drastic change from the roughly 5,000 that were assessed before at the start of the 2010 to 2020 Global Strategy for Plant Conservation. There have been great strides made and really have increased greatly in the last 2 years, especially. And the threatened species follows along with this pattern. But it's important to note that a lot of the species that are easiest to assess up front are the least concerned species. So we've really made the biggest effort in assessing those least threatened species. It will be interesting to see as we continue to progress towards the end goal if this threatened line continues in this pattern. To look at the assessments again in 2010 before the 2010 to 2020 strategy, we can see the threatened assessments here. The red, the orange, the yellow take up quite a bit of the percentage of species assessed, more than 3/4. And again, that is because there was much less species that were assessed in 2010 before we embarked on this effort. And since many of the least concerned species have been tackled, and you can see that represented in the 2020 graph. And just to highlight those numbers again, we have drastically increased the numbers in the last 10 years of species assessed. So I want to discuss why it's so important to highlight Botanic Gardens and their efforts in conservation assessments. And it's that Botanic Gardens contribute quite a bit to plant conservation, and we are starting to see more strategic plans from Botanic Gardens incorporate plant conservation as a goal. Some of the ways in which gardens are able to contribute are to help identify and prioritize species at risk, which is where the Red List and NatureServe come in play, the threat assessments, conservation assessments, to conduct research on the grounds ex situ by collecting those species that we have identified and prioritized as threatened, to conduct and support in situ research in regions where threatened species occur, and then to network and educate, because gardens are living museums and they have the unique opportunity to educate the public about the threatened status of plants. So I will discuss my project. I'm working on the assessment of US trees, of all native continental US trees. And this is actually a collaboration with a couple of organizations, including NatureServe, which Anne Francis is representing, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, United States Botanic Garden, and the Morton Arboretum. We had 4 goals in addressing the native US tree assessments. We wanted to first establish a checklist of all native US tree species, because that hadn't existed yet, at least for the continental US species. We wanted to update the Red List and NatureServe threat assessments, and then perform information exchange between the Red List and NatureServe assessments to align them where applicable. To create the checklist, we began in 2016, and we collected species lists from a variety of sources, including Biotics, USDA Plants Database, Global Tree Search, IUCN, BONAP, and Flora of North America. Between 2017 and 2018, we worked on refining that list to remove duplicate species, non-continental natives, questionable taxonomy, and shrubs, anything less than 2 meters. We are currently, last year primarily, we worked on reporting the list to organizations. We're continuing that a bit into this year to ensure that they are incorporated into other databases and that they align with other databases. This was done already with the Global Tree Search. And then our last step will be to publish the list, and that is when we release the report with the full checklist and the updated NatureServe Red List assessments. And the goal is to have that completed by the end of 2020. And the checklist has produced 846 native US continental tree species. This is where we are at currently as of June 2020. Right now, the Red List assessments and NatureServe assessments, you can see, align fairly well. Many more least concern species for both assessments, which is encouraging. And you can see we have less than a fourth of species left to assess on the Red List, and less than a fifth to assess on NatureServe. These the red outlines on both assessments are meant to signify the alignment of those databases. So those are all the threatened species on the Red List and the threatened species on NatureServe, whereas these bright green outlines show the least concern species. So we are hoping to complete all the assessment updates again by the end of the year. And finally, we wanted to exchange information between the Red List and NatureServe assessments where applicable. So we've been reviewing the assessments on both platforms to identify where they do not align. The biggest concern is making sure there is not a threatened assessment on NatureServe that is considered least concern on the Red List. We want to ensure that the assessments make sense again across both platforms and that data is shared appropriately. So we also need to determine if the assessments should be matched, if it makes sense to translate the data between the different databases, the different assessments. And if so, then we will be reassessing whichever species do not match correctly, and also utilizing a crosswalk methodology, which I will discuss briefly now. This was a project that has been floated for some years now, and we've started to work at it. The first step was to, again, identify the misaligned assessments. Where are species threatened on one platform and not threatened on the other? Or where do species assessments exist on one platform and not on the other? This project itself has really looked at starting with NatureServe to Red List, but it can be translated back and forth. So we could do Red List assessments to NatureServe. We then downloaded the data from NatureServe, where the assessments didn't exist on the Red List, but did on NatureServe, used Microsoft Access to translate those assessments for a format that would be able to be uploaded to the Red List, specifically to SIS Connect, which is their database to upload large data sets. We then uploaded and reviewed the assessments to make sure that all of the data was correct and that there wasn't any major missing pieces of information. And then to review the assessments one last time and publish them. Some takeaways from that project were that it was important to, again, review the species assessments to make sure that they were worth doing the crosswalk for, because some assessments, the data translation didn't make sense or it didn't match up. Also, some species required more effort for little reward. It took quite a bit of energy to convert these species assessments, and was incredibly useful for species with a lot of information, less useful for species with little information. And it's important to establish a connection with an IUCN partner for the SIS Connect upload. They are the experts in this database, and they will be the most useful. So if you are interested in possibly doing a database crosswalk, because we believe that this can be expanded beyond NatureServe to Red List and incorporate other assessment methodologies, please contact me and I'm happy to discuss it further.
Great, so I am going to talk a little bit about the assessment progress that we've made at NatureServe on North American plants in collaboration with others. I wanted to briefly explain a little bit about the NatureServe network, who we are and what we do. So NatureServe as an organization helps to coordinate a network of over 80 programs throughout the US and Canada and parts of Latin America. We formed around 50 years ago with the purpose of providing quality scientific information for the purpose of informing conservation efforts. So what we really focus on are the rare plants, animals, and ecosystems found within each state in the US and each province in Canada. And we follow the same methodology, which allows for easy roll-up to regional or national or international scales. So our network programs have over 1,000 conservation professionals, including botanists, zoologists, ecologists. These folks are what we call the boots on the ground. They're the people who are doing the surveying and monitoring of rare plants in their states. At NatureServe Central, we are compiling and aggregating that data in ways that make sure that everything aligns. And we also do the conservation status assessments that I'll talk about in a minute. One thing I wanted to highlight that we released very recently is a species at risk map featuring rare plants from each state and province of the US. You can see a close-up of one you may be familiar with, Schwalbia americana, and this is available for download if you're interested. But it's this kind of network collaboration that allows us to pull together resources at national and international scales. So before I explain this slide, a lot of people ask, well, why are there two different threat assessment platforms? Why have NatureServe system and the Red List system? It's a very good question. The reason is they evolved separately, and lately we collaborate a lot on the different factors. But because they evolve separately, NatureServe's assessments are used extensively by government agencies in the US and Canada. And they are very well integrated in policies and laws that would be hard to undo at this point and replace with the Red List system. So what we do is we collaborate very closely with our Red List partners. The two platforms are different, but they use a lot of the same underlying data, which allows for projects like Christina was explaining, where we're able to take data from NatureServe and export it and become the basis for a Red List assessment. So we're able to help each other in those ways. The NatureServe system of conservation status assessments, also called ranks, basically rank extinction risk on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the most imperiled and 5 being the most secure. And what's a little bit different about our system is that we do it at 3 geographic scales: subnational or state, national, and global. And these 3 geographic scales are meant to be nested within each other so that they make sense as a unit, as a system. They are also linked with the spatial data provided by our member programs. And most species have been comprehensively assessed in the US and Canada. However, many of them, especially the common ones that are not often our focus, need to be reassessed. And this is, again, where our Red List partners can help us. So this is an example of how you can access our data. It's on NatureServe Explorer. And this is just a snapshot of golden seal, which many of you may be familiar with, that highlights how you can see how the global status overall shows that it's vulnerable, but you can get specific statuses at the sub-national level indicating how common or rare it is in each state or province. You can also see when the status was last reviewed, the method reviewed, and as you scroll through the page, you can get a whole lot of other relevant conservation information. So Christina already talked about our awesome collaboration assessing trees. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of our other collaborations. One of them that's very active right now is on the medicinal plants of North America. This is a partnership with two botanical gardens, the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware and the Albuquerque Biopark in New Mexico. The picture shown on the right is a species of Trillium georgianum, and I highlighted that because we came together in the fall at a workshop at Mount Cuba to assess the conservation status of all Trillium in North America. We're doing both red list assessments and global ranks together as a group, and it's been a wonderful way to pool resources and feel like we're getting the best available information from the experts to update this group. We're also collaboratively working on a booklet that's going to feature the results of these assessments as well as other conservation information. Some other collaborations we've been involved in the past have included the Global Cactus Assessment, a project to assess the extinction risk of rare orchids, a regional project for the North Atlantic part of North America, coming up with regional ranks. And we're also very involved with the Plant Conservation Alliance, the non-federal group, and many of the members of that group are botanical gardens.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kim McHugh, and I would like to share progress that we at Desert Botanical Garden have made in doing red list assessments for a couple of groups of succulent plants. Before I get into the details of that, I wanted to share that we actually became quite vested in doing red list assessments back in 2015, the end of 2015, when we made a commitment to be the host institute for IUCN's Cactus and Succulent Plant Specialist Group. Around that same time, the specialist group had published the results of the Global Cactus Assessment, which has already been mentioned briefly in the presentation. And we were very impressed with it, and we had participated in that. But given that our collection is all desert plants, over half are cactus, and we also have an agave CE collection that is recognized as a national collection, we thought that we had a lot to offer in terms of assessing conservation status of this particular type of plants. And so after the cactus assessment was completed and we became the host institute, we worked with the specialist group leaders to determine the next priorities for a project that would be our first collaboration as the host with the specialist group, and we decided on the agave CE. Because of various factors, we decided to focus our assessments on two genera within that group, the agaves and the yuccas. And at the beginning, we decided the very first thing that we needed to do was develop a consensus taxonomy. Again, another activity that's already been mentioned. We recognized that the taxonomy within these groups was a bit messy. And so with our staff researchers taking the lead and collaborating with other experts, both in the US and Mexico, we developed a list, taxonomic list for these two genera that everyone agreed on, and that was the basis for beginning our assessments. The initial part of the assessments was done through an in-person or in real life red list assessment workshop that was held in Querétaro, Mexico. And we had 28 expert participants that came from 6 countries, and we spent a very intense week doing assessments of many species. However, we did not come close to completing assessments for all of those species, and so we embarked on what now has been about a 1.5 year process of continuing assessment work, reviewing assessments, finalizing assessments, and starting brand new assessments out of the Desert Botanical Garden, working with our co-chair of the specialist group, who is in the UK, and with other specialists in various parts of the world. And we published our first assessments, completed assessments, in late 2019, and we have done a couple more uploads since then. We're almost complete with publishing our assessments of these 2 genera. And so I wanted to share the results to date of these assessments. So for the genus agave, from our consensus taxonomy, there are 159 species total. Now, within agave, as with many groups, there are a lot of infra-specific taxa, but red list assessments are done at the species level. And so we had 159 assessments that we set out to complete. These are the data for where we stand at the moment. We've almost completed everything. You'll see not evaluated is 12. That doesn't mean that they won't be evaluated. It means that we have not completed these yet, but they will be done. The most striking result, I think, is that it has been determined that one of the species that we evaluated is now extinct in the wild, and that is the species that I've pictured here, agave lurida. The good news about it is, and this is definitely waving the flag for XC2 collections, is that Desert Botanical Garden, as well as some other gardens, do have specimens of this particular species in their collections. And so there is still hope for agave lurida. Then you can see the numbers continuing here for critically endangered, and vulnerable. So those are the 3 categories in the red list that indicate a state of conservation threat. And then, as has also already been mentioned, least concern tends to be the biggest category. So for agaves, we have 59 of least concern. And frankly, that's a weird hope. The more species that are of least concern, the better. And then for yuccas, this is a bit of a smaller group. Again, working through to get our consensus taxonomy, there are 55 species total. There are 11 yet to be completed, but they will be completed. Happily, there are none that have been assessed as critically endangered, but nonetheless, you can see there are quite a number still in that threatened category. And working on the yuccas has been particularly revealing to our researchers and some of the other experts outside of our institution that we've worked with. And what's been revealed to us is been interesting on a number of levels, including that as we've worked our way through the data that's available to us, including occurrence records, we discovered that there are quite a significant number of specimens in herbaria that were incorrectly identified. And so as we worked through each individual assessment, there's been a lot of work done to correct those identifications, which meant it revising our element occurrence records, our distribution maps, and all of this has an impact on how the assessments eventually shake out. We also realized that there are some things about these yuccas that require additional research. It's already spurred us to do additional targeted field work by our researchers, and we know that there's a lot more that needs to be done, both on the grounds, in the molecular lab, and in the herbarium. And so one of the things that I definitely wanted to share about working through this process for us as an institution and as researchers is that doing these assessments really revealed a lot of needs. So not just telling us what the conservation status of these species are and helping to direct us in terms of our conservation planning and the contributions we can make in that arena, but also in some pretty big holes or gaps in our knowledge about a lot of these species. And that has given a really interesting impetus to a lot of the focus of our research program going forward. And so with that, I will say that, again, there are A handful of these species in the agave and yucca still to be evaluated, but they will be completed soon. Almost all of these assessments are already up on the red list. And then one final thing is that we also assessed 3 species of Hespero yucca. There are only 3 species of Hespero yucca. They are all of least concern. And because least concern are the easiest to assess, we said, well, okay, we'll throw those in as a bonus. So, so there we are for the moment. Thank you.
So thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to present our project on Mexican tree assessments on this Congress. So this project is basically being carried out by 3 persons. Apart from myself, there is Esteban Martinez, who is a botanist of the National Herbarium of Mexico. He's very knowledgeable on trees, as well as on the Mexican territory. So actually, a lot of the information we are able to include in the assessment is based on what he actually has observed in the fields. And we are assisted by Alejandra Celeste, who we have been able to employ through our project. And this is actually very important, as we are both full-time, well, more than full-time, working with different projects. So we are working on endemic and near endemic trees. With near endemic, we mean species shared between northern Mexico and the southern US states, as well as tree species shared with northern central Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. So this is a slide actually prepared by Alejandra, as she is starting always for each species, getting the information on her own. So a very important step, well, in all assessments, but in this case it is very particular because the creation of the maps is very time consuming, because actually the information that is to be found on GBIF is very incomplete. So we have to start from zero, basically, for all maps using databases, mainly the database of the National Herbarium of Mexico, where Esteban works, which fortunately, especially in this time, has a lot of its specimens scanned and available online. We also use other virtual herbaria in the regional floras, taxonomic treatments, and so on. And so this map is thoroughly checked by Esteban based on his knowledge whether the information is correct, because there is a lot of there are a lot of problems, as already mentioned by Kimberly too, with the identification of the specimens. And then so we prepare the pre-assessments with all the information, again using a lot of databases, both in Mexico and international databases. We don't have a lot of collaboration, as I will mention later on, with other botanists in Mexico, because I assume that they don't think it's particularly interesting to work for such an international project. But nevertheless, we look for feedback and review whenever possible by specialists. So then we compile all the information in SIS, send it to a reviewer, which is someone from the Global Tree Specialist Group mainly, and then we send it to IUCN. With respect to numbers, we started in 2018 with this project based on, well, using a list that came from Global Tree Search, where there is an estimated number of 3,000 species, 3,003 species in Mexico, and about 1,340 endemic species. But we think, actually, based on the continuing work, this is heavily underestimated, and we think there is more than double the amount of endemic species. But of course, this is also only something we realized during the project, and it's only the 3 of us. We won't be able to finish everything, but we are making great progress. Next slide, please. So on the left-hand side, the percentage of endemic taxa, endemic and near endemic taxa, we assessed by category. And you can see that actually more than 60% of the species we have assessed are categorized in an endangered category, with endangered, the category endangered taking up more than 30%, critically endangered 10%, vulnerable 22%. Actually, less than 1/3 of the species are least concern. Something to try is really to reduce data deficient species as much as possible. We only have 2%, mainly due to nomenclatural taxonomical issues and species that have not been collected, let's say, in the last 100 years, or that only known from their type localities. And you can see that, unfortunately, we also have some extinct species.
I'll go on my question and answer in like
in the wild.
a couple
And then
minutes.
at the right side in the diagram there,
Yeah,
we
so I'm just going to be
summarize
in there, and then I'm going to be live on the question and answer, and then once I'll be
families
done.
assessed with endemic taxa. And the largest family is Borsraceae, which you may know from Copal or
I think it just makes sense.
in the US,
It's really not a big difference leaving tomorrow.
which is making up 20% because it's largely endemic to Mexico. And then the other families, they are not at all endemic, but they have a lot of endemic taxa. And very importantly, those taxa are occurring in specific vegetation types, which are very widespread in Mexico. For instance, like a desert, where we find Asparagaceae, or a tropical dry forest, where we find a lot of Fabaceae or Euphobaceae, and cloud forest, where we may find, for instance, Clayteraceae and Robiaceae. Next slide, please. So some final considerations. We have now about 50% of all the assessments done. We expect to have about 20-25% more done by the end of 2020. Something that we realize is that in some of the assessments we are reviewing of colleagues who have been working on Mexican endemic tree species as well, of specific families, is that they are basing their AOO and EO on niche modeling analysis, which we find not reflecting the actual situation in the Mexican territory. So we prefer to base the assessments on known localities. Something we also struggled with during this project is that we could not motivate the Mexican botanical community to participate actively in this project, although we emphasized that the assessments count as publications. Something else which is very important is that specialists not always share their information, especially if it's unpublished, but we find that very important given that we are talking about conservation of species. And a final consideration is related to safety issues in Mexico, in specific areas, mainly related to narcotics, commercial activities, illegal activities, which both make it impossible to find out about actual conservation status of species and affect the conservation status of a lot of species throughout the territory. That's it. Thank you very much.
Aloha. Thanks for having me here. I'm pleased to give an update on the work of the Hawaiian Plant Specialist Group. The goal of our group is to prevent the extinction of our native plants by raising awareness of their value and conservation needs. Our members represent an informal alliance of public and private agencies and organizations who work collaboratively to collect, propagate, and reintroduce rare plants and protect their habitats. The group also meets regularly to assist recovery efforts, promote efficient use of resources, and pass along accumulated knowledge by developing best management practices. The first Hawaiian plants were assessed in 1998 for the Red List. Since that initial effort, and up until recently, when the IUCN World Conservation Congress was held in Hawaii, the focus has been on getting rare plants added to the United States Endangered Species List. Enormous progress was made during these years, and now almost half of all the plants on the list are endemic to Hawaii. The World Conservation Congress was an inspirational event for our local conservation community, and it really motivated us to assess more of our species, starting in 2015. Since then, almost 300 assessments have been added. Currently, there are 518 plants that have been assessed and published on the Red List. This is about a third of our native flora. Our focus so far has been on assessments of rare species, and that's apparent in this chart. More than 3/4 of the plants assessed so far are are either critically endangered or endangered. Specialist group members live on different islands across the state. So members on Kauai focus on assessments for all the plants endemic to that island, and the rest of the group works on the other islands and the rest of the taxa. Some priorities for assessing species are flexible, but are easiest for the species we have data for, which are the rare plants. We prefer to start with plants that do not already have federal or state protections, especially rare species with less than 50 individuals remaining in the wild. We have almost 250 of them in Hawaii. We also look to taxa with known cultural value and a history of traditional use, and try to update, assess species that are expected to change their status. We hope to include groups of plants that are vulnerable to the impacts of recently established invasive alien organisms, like rapid ohia death, which is impacting our most numerous and important tree species. Recently, we have focused a lot on trees. We count 260 species of trees in our native flora from 34 families. More than half of these have been assessed so far, with the same emphasis on rare species. There are a handful of extinct trees, but far fewer than other types of plants in Hawaii. The species with assessments pending are not really data deficient, but just waiting on our attention. These are most likely to be assessed as vulnerable, as these are relatively widespread common species, which we have little information on. In the last few years, a new pathogen has caused extensive dieback in our most numerous and important native tree, Ohia lehua, has caused us to focus on assessments of these. We prioritize these assessments, and we're almost done completing the 14 interspecific taxa of Metrosideros. Our group has recognized several benefits from publishing assessments of Hawaiian plants on the Red List. The assessments provide important information, baseline information, about the conservation status of plants that are not legally protected by other means. Assessments in the category vulnerable include species where conservation actions and benefits have not yet been described for federally listed or state species. This is helpful in their conservation. The process of assessing these species promotes communication and coordination among local conservation agencies. And being global in scope, the Red List ranks the conservation needs of Hawaii's plants on a global scale, bringing important perspective to local problems. These assessments highlight our largest threat, which is alien invasive species, and help us promote the need for biosecurity. They also provide information on cultural uses and photos, which are lacking in other online resources. And finally, this has brought some much needed funding focusing on Red List species. Thanks much for your time. Aloha.
If you are interested in supporting any of the Red List efforts or NatureServe assessment efforts, then there are a couple ways that you can help. We would love to have some of your knowledge. If you feel that you are an expert in any of the areas that of the specialist groups that were presented today, I've included our emails above, and we can also, you can reach out and we can connect you with the right people. It's worth mentioning that it's important to mention that this is not an all-inclusive list of all the efforts to assess North American plant species. There are other specialist groups and individuals who are working to conduct threat assessments. So you can reach out to the Red List unit at redlist@iucn.org if you are interested in specific plant groups to find out who's working on those. You can also be a reviewer for species or an assessor by following the link provided here. And if you feel motivated and have a favorite species that you would like to help assess, you can go to the Red List or NatureServe website and check to see if those species are up to date or present. And if not, again, reach out to the Red List unit and find who you can connect with to get those species assessed. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much for that wonderful presentation. So we have a few questions for the panel. I guess to start off, I think maybe for each of you, we have a question about how are you each translating your efforts to engage the public and influence those in positions to advance conservation policy? If we want to start with maybe Christina and then go around.
Yes. So the question was translating your efforts to engage the public. So we haven't yet engaged a lot in conservation policy. That's something that we are interested in getting more involved in. As far as engaging the public, it's really about producing materials that include, like, the red list for US oaks was something that we produced back in 2018, I believe, and we'll be producing the US tree checklist that will be free and available online. That's the intention, so that the public can see what are the most threatened species and utilize, like, work on personally collecting them or advocating for them. We also, at our garden, specifically the Morton Arboretum, we have the conifer grove, which has all of the red list assessments listed on signage, and that's something that we would like to continue. We'll be incorporating more threatened species and signage for those threatened species at the garden.
Thanks, Christina. Kim, do you want to go next for that one?
Sure. So, yeah, I think I'm unmuted. So, yeah, I think we're kind of in a similar position as Christina. We certainly, through our role as the host institute for the Cactus and Succulent Specialist Group, we have created social media channels. We're trying to do outreach that way. Our program officer, which the garden supports, has been successful in her first year in increasing our followers, our engagement. And we also do things, messaging and so on, through the gardens, various media channels. You know, it's a slow process to build awareness and then start moving that into action. Interestingly enough, we've had what we consider a tiny victory quite recently, but it's with a species of agave that didn't qualify to be assessed under the red list because it's a cultivated species. It's pre-Columbian. It's something that our researchers have been working on for a while. A major site for it is in the footprint of a mining, soon to be put into operation, a mining claim. And one of our researchers who's an expert in agaves was able to go out, did interview with a reporter, did live filming at the site, and so on and so forth. And actually there's been a hold put on starting of mining operations in that area because of this plant. So yeah, it's a continual effort.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, Marie, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you. Yes, we also have not been able yet to do a lot of outreach to the public because, as I already mentioned in my talk, there is not a lot of interest, not from the botanical community and also not at political level, but we certainly have plans to change that, or to try to change that at least, once we have finished the project. And I'm sure that the experience of several of you can help there.
Anne, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, just real quick, there were a couple things I mentioned in the talk, including NatureServe's annual report that has a fold out map of rare plant species. We are also working on a Trillium booklet to highlight that. Our data are available on NatureServe Explorer. I think that a lot of people use NatureServe's information, but they don't
necessarily associate it with NatureServe. So they'll say, oh, this is a G1 plant, but they don't know what the G1, where it came from and who does it, sort of thing. I think we don't have a garden with, people visiting us. We are a nonprofit. And so we rely a lot on our partners to get the word out on rare species and how important they are. We do also engage with our network, our over 80 programs in the US and Canada that have more of a local base of people interested in their work.
Awesome. Yeah, and I would encourage everyone to read some of Anne's responses to a few of the chat questions. Matthew, did you want to also add something?
Yeah, sure. We work with a small local nonprofit, Laukahi, to try to advance public awareness of Hawaiian plants and their need for conservation. So we make sure to return all the red list assessments to them, and they use them in kind of a status report every year, tracking the Hawaii strategy for plant conservation and the number of plants that have been assessed. But there's always more need to do outreach. So some targeted fundraising to develop some materials would really be helpful for our efforts. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but if one of you wanted to, there was a question earlier about what is the easiest way for gardens to engage in red listing when we don't hold large collections. I know Christina provided her response. Do any of the other 4 panelists want to give their answer to that one to close out?
I could say a short something is that our local group is hosted by the Lion Arboretum, a garden that's affiliated with the University of Hawaii. So just by providing a meeting space where we can all congregate and get together to do the assessments, just simply really adds to our group's effort. So I think just any way that you can contribute staff time and space is helpful to these efforts, and has been for us.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for this session. If you'd like to keep the discussion going, please click the live discussions tab on the conference website and start a topic. We'd like to thank our presenters and all of you for being a part of today's session. Coming up next at 4 p.m., you can choose between a session on garden leadership transitions, or we also have the student presentations as your final session of the day. And thank you again for attending.